welcome everybody. Very special tour that we just went on and a conversation that's about to happen. I have many accolades for Shaul, so we're going to start with the basic bio, but there's much more to say than what's written here. Dr. Shaul Kellner is a friend and professor at Vanderbilt University, a leading scholar in the sociology of Jewish life today. His work focuses mainly on how Jews build connections with each other and support each other across different countries. His first book, Tours That Bind, involved him traveling on the ground with Taglit Birthright Israel trips. We see many of them here in the museum, to study how educators use tourism to connect diaspora Jews with Israel. He won awards from Association for Jewish Studies and the American Sociological Association. He's here today to talk about his newest book, which you can see over here, A Cold War Exodus. The book provides a deep analysis of how the Soviet Jewry movement not only achieved its goals, but also created a lasting cultural and political legacy within global Jewry. Just won a National Jewish Book Award, Mazal Tov. And through his research, we can give an applause, that's great. Through his research, Dr. Kellner sheds light on the mechanisms of mobilization, the interplay between activism and religious life, and the broader implications for contemporary Jewish advocacy. Very relevant today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're just going to jump right in. I have a number of questions at the end. We'll leave time for all of you to ask your questions as well. Thank you for being here. You describe the Soviet Jewry mobilization as it's a movement, but you describe it as a culture. Can you explain what that means and how it's different from other ways of thinking about the movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, let me say thank you to Anu, the museum, to Hodaya, to Sharon, to Rachel, also to Enid Wortman, who I know is watching on Zoom, who sent out and got some of the people here in the room, which is great. So thank you, and I'm really excited to be here. There is scholarship research on activism for Soviet Jews, and a lot of it focuses on the political dimensions of it. So, for example, in the United States, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was linking American trade policy to Soviet immigration policy, and a lot of the research was focusing on how did the act. That's interesting and important, and there's a lot of work on that. And when I started doing research on Soviet Jewry, I grew up in the United States, and I was mildly active in the movement. I was not a major activist. We can talk about that. But one of the things that I felt and that I noticed was missing in the research was whatever this movement accomplished for Soviet Jews, just the fact of mobilizing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it fundamentally shaped Jewish life in the States. And no one was really talking about that, and that was what was interesting to me. How did activists take a cause that really very, very few people in the States were familiar with, and they made it so that everyone knew, and it became, if you were engaged in Jewish life, inescapable. It was part of every type of Jewish institution.
Let's talk about some of those examples. Let's get into Jewish holidays. We love Jewish holidays. Say more. You could pick whichever one you want. We can start with Passover, I guess.
Let's start with Passover,
okay,
and then we'll go on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure.
Okay, this better? Okay. Okay, so in thinking about what the activists were trying to do and why they decided to engage Jews through Jewish holidays, 1960s, we should go back in time and just set a little bit of context. In the 1960s, most American Jews were not aware of what was happening to Jews in the Soviet Union. The United States government was not really interested in taking up the issue. And the few activists who knew that there was a problem and wanted to do something about it had to figure out what their strategy would be. And the strategy that they decided on was, look, we as individuals are not going to be able to change Kremlin policy. But if anyone has that power to put pressure on the Soviet government, it would be Uncle Sam. But how do you get the US government to do this if they're not interested? Because they're dealing with they have bigger fish to fry. And they're nuclear stuff, and there's Vietnam, and they don't want to touch issues of human rights inside the Soviet Union. So the activists came up with a strategy of get the Jewish institutions to press the US government to take up the issue, to press the Kremlin. But the Jewish institutions had not taken up the issue. So how are they going to do that? And the first step was get American Jews, millions of them, engaged to care about this, to know about this, and to pressure their synagogues and their federations and the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress and Hadassah and B'nai B'rith and all of that, then to pressure the US government. And that was the model. So how do you get Jews involved? Well, one of the ways that you engage Jews is in Jewish Americans is in those moments when they are most thinking and feeling and doing Jewish stuff. When's that? Well, Passover. It is the most popular holiday in the Jewish American calendar. And at the time, in the 60s, it was something like 80% of American Jews were attending a Passover Seder. And so activists in the 60s began deciding this is a great moment to get Jews engaged. And they began to do things like bringing the movement into the home by creating rituals around an extra matzah, a matzah of hope. That we raise this matzah of hope in solidarity with their 3 million brothers and sisters in the Soviet Union who are not free to learn of their past, not free to teach their children. And when they're engaging and mobilizing during holidays, the themes of the holidays start to come in to the ways that they're mobilizing. So the slogan, "Let my people go," it becomes the rallying cry for the movement. But there's an interesting thing about this, because when they first did this Matzah of Hope ritual in the 60s, and they said Soviet Jews are not free, and this is the holiday of the Exodus, and the slogan is "Let my people go." So you would think the first thing they would say is they are not free to leave. But the prayer didn't say that. It ignored it in 66, 67, 68, because at the time, Israel was not publicly pressing for mass immigration. It was impolitic, and they thought, listen, we're not going to be able to open the gates, so let's just focus on what we might be able to accomplish, which is cultural rights. So they only focused on that, but it was after 68 when Jews in the States began to learn of Soviet Jewish citizens who were demanding the right to emigrate, that they also began raising their voices and said, okay, let them leave. And of course, they put that as the first thing in the list. But imagine a Passover mobilization where they didn't demand the right to Exodus. And that's how the Passover mobilization started. So it's a weird thing.
That is a weird thing. Yeah. Wow. Okay. We'll talk a lot more about ritual, but I think it's interesting to raise now then the relationship between activism and religious observance, because the two are not the same. Did the movement reinforce or challenge Jewish religious identity?
Yeah. There was activism in all corners of the American Jewish community, religious, secular, right-wing, left-wing. The activists who were really mobilizing through religion were, for the most part, not only, but for the most part, modern Orthodox and conservative Jews who were who understood that for them, activism, freeing Jews from oppression, was a mitzvah. It was a religious obligation. And so by combining, they didn't see there was a distinction of religion and politics, or that they were politicizing the religion, that this was a sacred cause. And if you have a sacred cause, you have to express it through sacred means. You have to express it in your holidays. So Rabbi Avi Weiss, who was one of the leaders of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, would say, people say, why do you keep coming out to have these protest seders year after year after year? The Soviets aren't listening. And my response to you is, how can you celebrate Passover and not speak out for Soviet Jews? Like, how is that in the spirit of the holiday to stay silent when there are Jews that are oppressed and need liberation? So if you're being a good Jew religiously, that means that you're active for this. There were debates within Orthodoxy about whether to be active or not. Chabad took a different position, They were very quiet, but Chabad was operating in the Soviet Union with a whole network of activists who were teaching Torah, teaching Tanya, and the like, and they felt that public activism would threaten their ability to do direct service work in the Soviet Union. So there were a whole bunch of conflicts that were playing out in Orthodoxy, but by and large, this notion that, and it went beyond Orthodoxy, conservative, reform, Reconstructionist, all the denominations, this is how we are actually living our Jewish values. You know, we saw there is an empty chair out in the front of the museum for the hostages right now in Gaza. The empty chair was a symbol that you would find in synagogues of every denomination on the bima, and it was an empty chair for the Soviet Jew who was not present with us because they couldn't be present with us. So this is in the religious space. So the religious space, the holidays, life cycle events, it really brought the religion and the cause together.
So you said, just I think reminded all of us of the situation we're in now. How has October 7th affected your perspective on all of your studies and activism writ large?
You know, I started this project, in the early 2000s, and dipped in, dipped out, and then really began working on it in earnest in 2013, 2014 through now. And a lot changed in that time period. And when I started writing this, it seemed in a lot of ways that it seemed ancient history and forgotten history, and it's not ancient history. And that's really, really clear. It's not ancient history in the Russian-Ukrainian context. It's not ancient history in the Jewish-Israeli context as well. I think after October 7th, one of the things in the States that we saw was a real burst of anti-Zionism, the Soviet-style anti-Zionism that we thought we had defeated with this movement, but that it turns out it was not. We won a battle. We had not won the war, and it's surreal in some ways, teaching about activism against we at the time called it Soviet anti-Semitism. The Soviets referred to it as anti-Zionism. I'll say, you know what? Let's give them the term. It's toxic anti-Zionism, and it is oppressive, and we need to stand up and we need to fight against it. But to teach about the Soviet situation in university contexts where there is anti-Zionism all around us in American universities, you know, it makes it very, very timely. Sadly, you know, I wish that this were ancient history and we could just look back on it as this was a problem then and we defeated it, but we did not.
Thank you. That speaks to me.
I wish I'd be more optimistic about it, but that's, I think, the situation we're in.
When it comes to your studies, your main argument is that you're not studying Soviet Jewry, you're studying American sociology, American Jewry. Can you explain that?
Yeah. This is not a book about Soviet Jews. This is a book, whether the movement succeeded in freeing Jews from the Soviet Union, even before that, the movement had already succeeded in shaping Jewish life in the States. And it succeeded in shaping Jewish values to get people to realize, not just to realize, but to actually act and do things based on the idea that it is every Jew's responsibility to stand up and to do something when there are Jews in distress. And just by virtue of having done that, regardless of whether it was successful or not, it had made an impact in the world. And when we think about the ways in which the movement was successful and effective, you know, we'll usually focus on the most important outcome, which is it opened the gates, right? But it did not only affect Jews in the Soviet Union for the better, it also, and I say this, I'm focusing really on Jews in the US, but there's stuff in here about Jews in Canada and in Britain and in France and in Australia, really around the world, and in Israel as well. There were popular movements here too.
So let's get into some of the fun parts of activism and that culture. Can you talk about jewelry?
Yeah, all right.
Let's go for it.
So if anyone, I don't know if anyone saw in the display case here in the museum, there was a bracelet that had the name of a Soviet refusnik prisoner of conscience written on it. There was a medallion that, you know, these are medallions that are precursors in some ways to the medallions that a lot of us I see here are wearing right now. The problem that Soviet Jews were facing was largely invisible to Jews in the States. It's far away. It's not the type of, it was not the type of oppression that produced really graphic visuals for television. It was insidious. Glass ceilings, losing jobs, things like that. And it was the Cold War. And so news was not getting out. So how do you take this problem that's really far away and bring it close to home for Jews in the US? And one of the ways that the activists did this was to take the cause and to put it on people's bodies. So now think about when you're waking up in the morning, actually in the Shema prayer, when you lie down and when you rise up. Think about this, do this, say these words. People are putting on jewelry that have the names of Jewish prisoners, and that's the first thing that they're doing when they wake up. They're getting dressed. And the last thing they take off, if they take the jewelry off, at night. And so even at home, in the most private parts, like you're home, you're alone in your bedroom, you're going to bed, you're getting out of the shower, you're getting dressed, and on your body, you are thinking about Soviet Jews, and you're wearing this jewelry. So the stories, how they discovered or invented the jewelry, it's really some interesting stuff. There were activists in California, Cy Frumkin, Xavier Oslavsky. I'm seeing Laura Bialas here, who produced a phenomenal documentary, Refusnik, which I teach this at Vanderbilt. I think it's the only course in the States about Soviet Jewry movement, and I always begin with Laura's documentary because before the students can read and they need to see and they need to hear, and that just, it captures it perfectly. But so she interviewed them, and you can see them there. But so these are activists in Southern California. It's the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, it's really common in the United States for Americans to be wearing these metal bracelets with the names of POWs and MIAs in Vietnam, okay? And that whole thing of the bracelets actually started in Southern California. They're based in Southern California, so they know this. And they decide, we're gonna do this for Soviet Jews. But we're not gonna copy what what everyone else is doing. If the bracelet if that real estate is already taken up by Vietnam bracelets, we'll do something else and we will have a medallion. And so they created it was a Magen David, Jewish Star medallion, which on one side had a picture of a hammer and sickle, Jewish star, padlock, chains, and it said, "Let my people go." And on the other side was the name of a Soviet Jewish prisoner of conscience. And there was a CPA from, I don't know, Encino somewhere, who designed this. If you want to design jewelry, you go to a CPA. They went to a CPA. He designed. So they have some accountant who's designing this jewelry, and Frumkin he's a businessman, and they're trying to also think of ways, how do they fund their organization? And this is the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews and the Southern California Council. And he knows you can create these metal medallions for 10 cents, 20 cents, sell them for $1, and that's how they funded the organization. So they sold hundreds of thousands of these. And if you think there's a difference between, I'm looking at our Hearts Are Held Captive in Gaza medallions that people are wearing here. And for the most part, something is printed on one side, but the other side is blank. And on the Soviet Jewry medallions, there were names. And the name that would be on the medallion that I wore might be different from the name on the medallion that you would wear. And so that prisoner, I developed a special connection with, and you would develop a special connection with the prisoner whose name you wore. When they started selling medallions, you couldn't necessarily choose whose name you would get. In later iterations, they gave that opportunity. Okay, so in Britain, there's an organization called the 35s, the Women's Campaign for Soviet Jewry. And they see the medallions. CPA is designing this? So they walk, Doreen Gainsford walks into she's one of the leaders there, into a German street jewelry store. And there's a jeweler there he's a jeweler to Princess Anne, a jeweler to Ursula Andress, who was the first Bond girl. Elizabeth Taylor's wearing his jewelry. It was like really high-end stuff. And she gets him to donate a design to the movement. And so he creates this beautiful, beautiful pendant that's similar. The message is the same. Prisoner of conscience. They had Sylva Zalmanson's name. She was one of the activists who tried to steal a plane to fly herself to freedom. Was arrested and was thrown in prison. And they made versions that you could buy it in platinum, in gold, in silver, and you could buy the 5-pound version if you want. But they debuted it with Ingrid Bergman, actually. So, that's the difference between you have some men in LA who will go to a CPA, and you have the women's campaign, in Britain who knows that you got to do this right.
I'm loving this. I wonder if Lions of Judah, if they took notes.
I tried to find that out. I don't know when. I could not figure out when the Lion of Judah pin began, but I would imagine it's around the same time. I don't know who was inspired by whom, or if they realized, but yeah.
One idea that you alluded to was the personalization of it, of having someone's name, and something that you wrote about and spoken about is the twinning program. Do you want to tell us? Did you find that successful? What does success look like? What were maybe some of the flaws of the program?
Yeah, all right. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, activists combined a whole bunch of different things that they had been doing to create a new tactic to engage youth. They had, in the 70s, they were doing pen pals. So they thought, we want to mobilize the Jewish community, and who is the Jewish community? It's not just adults, it is everyone. And there are a lot of social movements that will ignore children. This movement did not ignore children. And when they started to figure out how do we engage kids in the movement, and this is also about teaching kids what does it mean to be a good Jew, like taking responsibility, they developed curricula, they developed pen pal programs with American Jewish kids and the children of refuseniks. They combined that with some of the religious activism that they had done around the holidays. And there were also tourist connections where activists in the States knew personally activists in the Soviet Union and developed really, really close relationships. And so they began pairing up their kids. So in the late 70s, early 80s, they decide to take this to scale. And they do what's called twinning, where they would pair American bar and bat mitzvah kids with a child of Soviet refuseniks, or a Soviet refusnik child. And the notion was the Soviet kid can't have a bar or bat mitzvah in the Soviet Union. It was more complicated than that. The children of activists, the activists could find ways to get their kids a bar or bat mitzvah if they wanted to. Most Soviet kids were not doing this because most Soviet Jews were not activists. And the social pressure was such that it's not done. Also, if you wanted to have a bat mitzvah, the synagogues in the Soviet Union that were there were Orthodox. There's not going to be a bat mitzvah in a Soviet synagogue at the time. That part, the activists didn't think that part through. But so they started doing this pairing, and it was a way of creating a personal connection. And this is, you think about how important is bar and bat mitzvah in American Jewish culture. Most rituals that Jews brought over to the States from whatever their old country was declined. Kashrut declines, Shabbat observance declines, right? Bar and bat mitzvah goes up, and bat mitzvah is invented in America. Okay, so boom, these are the rituals these are the quintessential Jewish American life cycle rituals. So think about the chutzpah for the activists to say, yeah, it's exactly this. And we're not rabbis, we're lay people from outside the synagogues, and we're going to tell the rabbis in the synagogues, what we should be doing for bar and bat mitzvah, and we should be telling kids and their parents, and the kids already have all this other stuff to do, and the parents are busy planning the parties. It's a lot, and they add this to it.
It's a lot, yeah.
It's a lot, yeah. I was speaking to a group of kids in LA a few weeks ago, and there were bat mitzvah age kids, and I said, are you busy? They're like, oh, so much to do. I said, so imagine that you're doing this on top of it. They were writing letters to the refusnik kids, and if the kids wrote back, great, the pen pal worked. And if the kids didn't write back, even better, because you learned about the oppression of Jews in the Soviet Union. The Soviets are censoring the mail. and the like. And then the kids would, the, think about like the sacred moments in the ritual itself. And there are two highlights of the ritual. So one is when the kid is called to the Torah, and the other is the sermon. And both of those moments became moments for the kids to raise awareness about Soviet Jewry. So the rabbi would call up the kid, the rabbi would call it the Soviet twin. So, Ya'amod, silence. Ya'amod, silence. Ya'amod, come to the Torah. And finally, the bar mitzvah boy or bat mitzvah girl would come to the Torah and recite the blessings in place of, or symbolically for, that absent Soviet twin. That's the moment when, if you think about how much the bar and bat mitzvah is focused on the individual kid. I remember at my bar mitzvah party, I had my name written in balloons. It was my name, and it's in balloons. It was all about me. Not all about me. I had a twin, Leonid Barras. It was also about him in that moment. And then at the sermon, the child is somehow connecting the Torah portion to the plight of Soviet Jews as filtered through the personal story of the kid that they're connecting to. And they're telling their parents and their grandparents and all their aunts and uncles and cousins and all their friends who were there. This is, by the way, tens of thousands of Jewish kids in the States did this. So if you went to a bar bat mitzvah in the 1980s, there's a good chance that you would have experienced this. Most American Jews who sat through the bar bat mitzvah service in the 80s were exposed to this. But you had a captive audience. And it was the kids telling their parents, now as a Jewish adult, I'm doing the right thing. What are you doing? So was it shaming the parents? No, the parents were kvelling. Yes, good. Like we raised our kids well. How it went wrong? You asked how it went wrong?
I don't know, but I'm also curious, were there any real long-term connections made? Any good stories there?
Yeah. So in the late 1980s, when the gates start to open, the bar and bat mitzvah twins start coming out and start showing up at the ceremonies, which is great. And this is in the news. This stuff also gets news coverage because the kids, they're writing to their Congress people, they're bringing the press. So it's also a lesson in American civic activism at the same time. But the key was, for this to work, the symbolism of it was that silence. Ya'amod, and it's silent. And there's the empty chair, and they would reserve a whole row of seats for the family of the Soviet twin because the seats are not filled, and you can see that absence is present, but now they're there. So, wow, that's really newsworthy. It gets covered. But that's the beginning of the end of the twinning programs, because when the twins are present in the room, it doesn't work. It really was about the absence. People will tell this story. It's the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, in his campaign literature for when he was running for governor, he said his introduction to activism was twinning, and there's a link there to Philadelphia Inquirer news coverage of the twinning, and not only did he twin his bar mitzvah, but he created an entire program of advocacy for his twin. So there were long-term relationships that were developed. If anyone knows Leonid Barras, who at some point was here, I don't know if he still is, I would love to connect with
Here
him.
in Anu, or?
No, here in Israel. So
you're welcome to come to Anu, Leon.
I was bar mitzvahed in New Jersey, 1982. These programs begin late 70s, early 80s. I'm still on the early end of it. And, I get up in front of the congregation, and I sent all these letters to my twin, Leonid Barras. His father was a journalist and was writing things that the regime was not happy with. And I'm not getting any letters back. Oh, the anti-Semitic government, they're censoring the letters. I'm doing research for this book, and I'm in the archives in New York, and they have all these files on refuseniks. So let me find out what happens to my bar mitzvah twin. He was already in Israel. He had actually gotten out. I didn't know. So how should I have felt in that moment? I should have been great, But there was also a part of me like, what do you mean? But I learned from that emotion, like this twinning, as much as it was about Soviet Jews, it was about American Jews and American Jewish identity. And that's how someone could, feel the sense of, wait a second, you gave me the name of a kid who was already out?
Oops.
I'm
sure it's meaningful. Let me ask you. So you've spoken about the impact that the mobilization had on American Jews. I'm actually going to switch this was a good transition. You're drinking, right? So it's a nice beverage. One thing that you spoke about and you wrote about and you've researched is about Pepsi, not the water that you're drinking from. Growing up, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, the home of Coca-Cola, and it was a religion to drink Coca-Cola. I didn't have a sip of Pepsi until we were out of
Chas
Atlanta.
v'chalila.
Chas v'chalila. But I had this impression that it was anti-Israel or what have you, but it sounds like there may be earlier beginnings that I was unaware of. Do you want to talk about that?
Okay, yeah. So and it's not just for people in Atlanta, but people growing up Jewish in the 70s and 80s in the States, and if they were connected to summer camps or Hillels or the like, might know that you would never see Pepsi in these institutions. Never, never see Pepsi. There was a boycott of Pepsi Cola, and how most people hear the story, Pepsi was participating in the Arab boycott of Israel. It was selling in the Arab countries. It was not selling in Israel. And therefore, Jews in the States will not drink Pepsi Cola. And if you think about the great tourist T-shirt that American tourists would come back with when they would visit Israel in the 70s and 80s, it was the Coca-Cola in Hebrew logo. Coca-Cola was kosher. Pepsi was treif. And the idea, because it was about Israel and the Arab boycott. That's not how it started. It became that, but that's not how it started. It actually starts in 1972 during détente. And the US and the Soviet Union, this is the Nixon-Brezhnev governments, are trying to create warmer, more stable relationships because we're worried about blowing each other up. And activists in the Soviet Jewry movement were saying, listen, stable relationship, but not on the backs of our people, and not at the expense of ignoring human rights violations in Russia. And part of détente were economic ties. So Pepsi Cola is the first American consumer product that gets manufactured and sold in the Soviet Union. How does that happen? If anyone remembers the kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev in the 1950s there was an American international exhibition. So before that happened, debating like which system was better, the guy who was representing Pepsi in Europe, he sets up, his name is Donald Kendall, and he sets up the Pepsi Pavilion at this exhibition, and he's in touch with Nixon for all the arrangements. He says, please get Khrushchev to come to the Pepsi Pavilion. And Nixon does this. Khrushchev comes to the Pepsi Pavilion, and Don Kendall puts in front of him, here we have Pepsi that we made in America, and here we have Pepsi where we brought the syrup and we produced it with water right here in Moscow. And Khrushchev, he takes the bait and he drinks both, and he says, drink the Moscow Pepsi, it's much better. Okay. So Kendall has a relationship with Nixon that goes all the way back to this. He then becomes the head of the corporate division of CREEP. If anyone remembers from Watergate, CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. So he's a big Nixon campaign supporter. And so when business ties are happening between the US and the Soviet Union, Nixon is going to his friend Don Kendall. And now, activists in the Soviet Jewry movement had been trying to think about how do we bring this distant movement close? Well, it's not just when you're going to sleep and waking up. How about every time you put something in your mouth? So it's America, right? It's cola. This is before the cola wars, but it's like as the cola wars are starting to ramp up, let's have a boycott. Because every time Jews are going to the supermarket or they're out at a restaurant and they're going to order something to drink, it's an opportunity to raise awareness for Soviet Jewry. They had originally tried with boycotts of Mack trucks, which were being sold in Russia, but Lou Rosenblum, who was one of the leading activists who helped to create the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews in Cleveland, he said, no one's buying Mack trucks. Like, Jews are not buying Mack trucks. There are a few, but if you want to get a lot of people, everyone's buying soda. Pepsi was boycotted.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll have to share this with my father. He was to my knowledge, the first Orthodox Jew to work at Coca-Cola,
All right.
or at least in corporate.
The Cola Wars were
Fascinating.
real, by the way. I mean, it was a serious thing. There were casualties. Michael Jackson, when his hair caught on fire, he was filming a Pepsi commercial.
Huh.
And the stars lined up on different sides of it. So there was a Jewish stance in the Cola Wars.
Act of God or faux pas? Good to know. When it comes to the impact on, we spoke about the impact on American Jewry. What was the impact on people, former USSR residents who moved to America? What did the impact of all of the years of activism and mobilization and infiltrating the culture, how did that affect them?
So look, the movement, I say the movement affected American Jews. The movement reshaped who American Jews are, right? There are now Jewish Americans, Soviet-born, children of Soviet immigrants, who are part of this community. So it's not an us and a them. The community's boundaries have expanded. It's become a much more diverse community. And so that, like, if you think about what the biggest impact was, it reshapes who are American Jews, right? For Jews from the USSR coming to the States, what starts as a distant encounter, and what starts actually as a symbolic encounter. In the 60s, no activists actually know any Jews in the Soviet Union and would be hard-pressed to name people. That changes, and that's a huge change that happens in the late 60s, early 70s, and all these tactics like twinning and the bracelets were dependent on that change, that there are Jews in Russia who themselves are activists, and we in the States know their names and are partnering with them. Okay. When people are coming out, most of the people who come out are not activists. But the way that Jewish Americans understand who Soviet Jews are, who Soviet Jewry is, who Soviet Jews are, it's filtered through the idea that all Soviet Jews are refuseniks. All Soviet Jews are deeply invested in Jewish identity, and so there's a real cultural mismatch of expectations. What American Jews expected of the Soviet emigres, what the Soviet emigres expected of American Jews, real surprise. And so it caused tensions, and this was something that I think even as it was causing tensions, people were aware at the same time that this was a challenge that they had to work through, and were trying to work through it, even as they were aware that it was a problem and they kept reproducing the problems. But a lot of that was because, this was really networks of activists who were not representative of the broader Jewish community itself. There were a lot of beneficiaries of this movement who were not directly engaged, but whose lives were shaped by it.
Let me ask you, I know this wasn't your area of study, but how do you think, humor me, the movement, the culture impacted Israeli society?
So in addition to the mass emigration, even more here than there, right? The movement also brought American Jewish activists from Israel from the US to Israel. Enid Wertman, for example, right, and who became active here and then was a liaison between American, Israeli, and Soviet activists. So this really was, it was a transnational movement. But if people are advocating in the States, not just let my people go, but let my people go and let's help them get to Israel. And doing this for years, people began to think, well, what am I doing in the States? And maybe my future should be here too. So the movement for some activists brought them here, and it was influential in that way. One of the things that I struggled to understand, and I still can't make sense of, I understand why there was mass mobilization in the US, because the idea was to pressure the US government, to pressure the Kremlin. I don't understand why there was mass mobilization in Israel, because the Israeli government was already on board with the issue, and the Israeli government did not have that much leverage vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So before there was a public campaign, actually not before there was a public campaign in Israel. Part of the reason why there was a public campaign is that what the government was doing was hush-hush. And so Nativ, which was known at the time, was known as the Halishka, the office, or the office with no name, was created by people who were connected with the intelligence services, It reported directly to the prime minister, and it was working in the Soviet Union while there were diplomatic relations. And then when diplomatic relations were severed, it worked outside of the Soviet Union. And it also worked to support activism in the West. But this was a government interest. There were government offices that were doing things. So why was there an activist movement in the States beyond the notion that Jews care about other Jews and standing up? And it's just a basic issue of values. But what the strategic motivation was, I understand for the US, and I don't understand it for here. So if anyone has insight.
I mean, part of me thinks about now as we see hostages coming home.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the plan is to bring the hostages home, but the impact that it's had on them and their morale and them being cared about, I would imagine that must matter long term.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the scenes of Soviet Jews landing on the airplanes here in Israel, and how they were greeted, and the outpouring of joy that you would see, there was something about morale, a sense that, look, this country was created with a mission to make sure that Jews will be safe everywhere, and that if there are places in the world where Jews are not safe, we're going to help them to get out. And in the case of the Soviet Jewry movement, that promise was realized. So it's fulfillment of national mission. That's the purpose. And so you have an engaged citizenry that's on board with that mission. So yeah, maybe not we're going to leave it to the hands of the government. We're also going to do something.
One thing that I'm thinking about is a lot of what you studied and wrote about, it was new. It was really thinking out of the box about how to engage people, how to make it personal, how to make people feel like it's in their kishkas, that they want to be a part of this movement. And there was a sort of build up to the public outcry, particularly in massive rallies. With what's happening now, I kind of see the opposite, where we started out in mass with massive public protests. If you want to speak to some of that.
Yeah. The two largest rallies in American Jewish history were 1987 on the National Mall for Soviet Jewry. It was organized in something like 6 weeks. Natan Sharansky was one of the key people who suggested that we have this rally. The idea was to give support to President Reagan when he was speaking with Gorbachev at a summit, to basically let Reagan say, look at all these people here, now let's see some concessions. About 250,000 people. And then in November of 2023, 300,000 people on the National Mall in support of Israel after the October 7th attacks. And one of the key differences was that the rally on the Mall in '87 was, in a sense, it was like the culmination of 30 years of grassroots mobilizing, not in Washington, but in every synagogue in the country, and in every Hebrew school and JCC and the like. So it was a real bottom up, whereas this rally, I mean, in parts because it was a crisis, immediate, it had to be a top-down organized centrally. So the fact that activists for Soviet Jewry no one knew if this movement was going to succeed, how long it would take, right? It's the Cold War, and Jews are going up against the nuclear armed superpower. Like, really? We really think that we could win? Yes, but that's chutzpah. But we didn't know how long. And so we knew that no matter what, we just have to keep this movement going. There may not be any immediate success, but we still have to do things. And the activist strategies, I think, were really designed for that. And that's when I think about how this movement was a cultural movement. It was, regardless of whatever the political issues of the day were, the culture was there. So in the 1970s, or the 1960s, the issue was cultural rights. Let them bake matzah. And that was like the what's the ask? In the 1970s, the goal was, all right, get the immigration tax revoked, get the gates open. In the 1980s, when the Soviet Union actually restricted immigration, it was to get them to release prisoners whom they had arrested. So the political goals at any moment changed. But the notion that no matter what, we still have to be thinking about an active for Soviet Jewry when we're getting up in the morning, when we're at school, when we're at prayer, when we're celebrating our holidays, when we're celebrating our life cycle events, when we're at play and leisure. And if you're going on tour, instead of going to the Caribbean, go to the Soviet Union, and you can actually take your tour and you can do something good, right? So every moment you can be doing something, and that was like keeping the culture. And I think that's because we knew it was a long haul campaign that activists built the movement in this way. Now we're in a moment of responding to crisis when we were caught off guard. We thought we were safe, we thought we were secure. I'm saying here and also in the States, right, and around the world, and we're now in that phase of waking up to realize, okay, we now have groundwork that we have neglected that we have to begin doing.
Very insightful. Thank you. I have many more questions, but we actually have an audience full of people who are very interested, have been activists and what have you, so we're going to start taking questions from the audience. I'm going to
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So the question is, what actually convinced the Soviet Union to change its immigration policy, and were there any other groups that it actually let out into the other groups that had advocates outside the USSR? So the Soviet immigration policy generally was no immigration for anyone, and the fact that the Kremlin was responsive to this movement and changed the policy and allowed Jews to leave, not all, but a lot, and then a lot, was the result of pressure. It was not the result of, it's not as if the Soviets capitulated to direct pressure. The movement made immigration rights for Soviet Jews a Cold War issue. So when the Soviets wanted to signal to the West that they wanted to play nice, they opened the gates. And when they wanted to signal to the West that they were going to be confrontational, they closed the gates. So this period of the early 1980s, this is post-détente, when you have Andropov and Chernenko and the series of leaders who died. Yeah. That moment, they were signaling, they closed the gates, right, as a signal. So what the movement succeeded in doing was making Soviet Jewry a symbol that the Soviet government could use, and that had the benefit for Soviet Jews in those times when they wanted good relations with the West, that they opened the gates. There were two other groups that had outside, the three other groups that had outside advocates that the Soviets changed policy for. Armenians, ethnic Germans, both of whom have diaspora communities, and there were also some evangelical Christian groups as well who had evangelical Christians advocating for them. But the difference for the evangelicals is that their goal was not to get Christians out of the Soviet Union. Their goal was to get the word of Christ into the Soviet Union. So the idea that they would bring the Christians out and leave Russia void, of divine word, that was, from their religious perspective, that was against the goals of what they were trying to do. So it didn't really affect immigration, but it did affect religious policy for evangelical groups. Okay, so the question is, to what extent were the American Jewish feelings getting involved to save Soviet Jewry affected by feelings of guilt or shame at not having been able to save European Jewry during the Holocaust? That was huge. That was huge. There were a number of things that were at play in terms of the identities, and the short list would be Holocaust guilt, American civil rights activism, Cold War, notion of American freedoms. Those are the big three. And Zionism as well, the big four. Holocaust guilt plays in a lot of ways. So there were generational politics where the student groups, these are young baby boomers, 1960s, the baby boomers, when they were protesting, they had a slogan. This is not Soviet Jewry. Don't trust anyone over 30. And these were the generational politics of the 1960s, where the young baby boomers were critiquing the ways that their parents and grandparents had been doing politics. And the Jewish variant of that were young Jewish baby boomers pointing to their parents and grandparents and saying, you did not do enough, you were silent, and we are not going to be silent. This time we will not be silent, was one of the slogans. Okay, the accusation is, it was a real accusation. It oversimplified, it was unfair in a lot of ways. But at the same time, the older generations also felt the sense of guilt. We tried to do what we could do. We were powerless to do more than we did. We enlisted in the army. We tried to move the government, but the situation for American Jews was much more precarious in the 1940s than it was in the 1960s. And American Jews also in the 1960s are looking to the Black Power movement. And are saying, where American blacks are standing up, they're saying black is beautiful. And they're not going to be ashamed, and they're not going to be, they're looking at the gay pride movement later in the 70s. They're not going to go in the closet. And Jewish Americans are influenced by these same things. We're here, and we're standing up as Jewish Americans for our own interests, and we're demanding that America also respond to us. So that also played in. Elie Wiesel plays a crucial role in this, because he goes in to write a travel log, to basically tell Jews in the West what's going on with Soviet Jewry. And he goes in 1965, he publishes a series of newspaper articles here in Israel and in France. They're translated and they become the book, The Jews of Silence. And Elie Wiesel he's halfway at that time between when he's liberated from Auschwitz and when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. But he's known still at that moment as the voice of Holocaust testimony. And so at the end of this, and by the way, Nativ sends him. He's friends with Nativ officers in France who he knew from college, Mayor Rosen, and I forget the other, do you remember who? And they say, listen, we know factually, statistically, what's happening to Jews in the USSR, but we need someone who can tell the story. And we need a poet. We don't need a statistician, we need a poet. And if you read The Jews of Silence, it's all about the aura of fear, the aura of oppression. It's a tone poem in a way. There is an appendix at the end that will give you all the facts and figures and stats, but that's not the part that Elie Wiesel wrote. Elie Wiesel, at the end of this book, he ends by saying, what torments me most is not the Jews of silence I met in Russia, but the silence of the Jews I live among today. That is an arrow to the heart of American Jewry, because it's not just anyone saying, Holocaust guilt, we didn't do enough. It's Elie Wiesel who's saying we're being silent. This was huge.
I think we have room for another question or two. Go ahead.
Thank you. Absolutely. every time they were there. It's all in there. It's all in the book. It's all in the book. It's all in the book. Yep. Yeah. No, yeah, so, right. So it's really about how difficult this was, and that's also a lot of what the book is about how the tactics were invented, because the movement did not just create itself. And I think in retrospect, it's very easy to tell the story of, and that's why I tell the story of when they first created the Matzah of Hope. They didn't say, "Let my people go." They didn't say, "Free to leave," which is crazy when you think about it, but because this movement had to be invented. It didn't exist, and if it were not for the work of activists, it would not exist. So, in the 1970s, think about how few people knew. It was, it's constant work, and it's remembered as We Are One in a moment of real unity. There was a lot of factionalism in the movement. One of the interesting things in studying this is I'm talking with activists from the Union of Councils and the National Conference. These are the grassroots and the establishment sides, and the different stories. And I was not involved in this. I didn't have a dog in the fight. But what I was able to see was, in spite of those differences, there still was a unified movement culture. How was there a unified movement culture? So Philadelphia, for example. Okay, so I know that, so it's a great example of it. We have Joe and Connie Smuckler's daughter and granddaughter here, and they were prominent activists in the movement overall, and in Philly. So there were communities like Philadelphia where the main Soviet Jewry organization had connections both with the Union of Councils, the grassroots, and with the National Conference, the establishment. And so information could flow between the grassroots and establishment and then go up to the national organizations and get disseminated out. And so when I was looking at, it's really interesting, like among the things that I found in archives were travel logs. There are thousands of travel logs of people who went, but they were sent, some were sent by the establishment groups, some were sent by the grassroots groups, but there are duplicate copies of the travel reports that they wrote from both sides.
Oh man, we'll add one and then one last question. Go for it.
Just to repeat what Laura said, right? Right, what Laura Biala said, that why Philadelphia was an exception, because Enid and Connie were really, really close friends. I was born there. I know a lot of people who would agree with that.
We have time for one final question. We have to repeat that.
Okay, let me just repeat this for the mic. When you were twinned, you were twinned, and you were twinning with 15 kids in the States. Not in the States, all over the world. All over the world. England, yeah. saying that when you came to the States in 1988, you had a rally with all of your twins. Amazing. Okay, 89, yeah, yeah. Wow. That's great. That's great. Thank you. Great, thank you. So talking about the relationship between Nativ and the National Conference and the Union of Councils, Nativ and the National Conference had a close relationship. There was a lot of information flow. But when the Union of Councils, one of the reasons that the Union of Councils developed its tourism program was to create an independent line of information so it would not be dependent on Nativ. So this was a really interesting moment in Jewish American history, because we think of it, it's not just that Jewish Americans went up against the Soviet Union. They also, Nixon was not in favor of Jackson Vanik. Like, American Jews fought against the United States government. And Israel, wanted all the Soviet Jews to go to Israel, but American Jews were saying, listen, we're talking about freedom of choice. And American Jews went up against the Israeli government. It was the one moment, I think, in Jewish American history where Jewish Americans really asserted themselves as an independent, self-confident, autonomous actor vis-a-vis the USSR, USA, Israel. That was backbone, that was spine. And I don't know if American Jews appreciate how important that moment was in history for their own community. Two Jews, three opinions. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah. So how do we explain factionalism in the movement? Look, in a lot of ways, the factionalism. Gal Beckerman, in his phenomenal book, When They Come For Us Will Be Gone, he refers to it as the overall orchestra. And the idea having grassroots, super energetic, pushing establishment groups to do more, having establishment groups that have enormous reach, that beyond what the grassroots groups could do, that combination ended up serving the movement really well. The fact that there was a lot of duplication gave many more people opportunities to personally get engaged, and it took what could have been a very professionalized campaign, and it made it a massive grassroots success. So I know that for the activists going through it at the time, enormously frustrating in the fights, from my perspective, in retrospect, it actually was a good thing.
You're welcome to. We can continue the conversation, but I also want to give the opportunity to thank Dr. Shula Kellner for coming today.
Thank you.
Um, for those
Toda
of you,
rabah, spasiba.
for those of, okay, sorry. Okay, we'll keep going.
Agreed. Yeah, okay. Yeah, a few words about Jacob Birnbaum and Glenn Richter, I'd like to say as well, in Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. Um, yeah, yeah. So in the inauguration of sustained public protest for Soviet Jews in the States begins at Columbia University. This was back when Columbia was, was a good place for Jewish
Good terms.
organizing, right? Right, exactly. So, but it started at Columbia University. Jacob Birnbaum, Glenn Richter, they are organizing students, and they organize. They call it the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. They established this group in April of 1964. A few weeks earlier, there was a conference in Washington, D.C., where all of the large establishment Jewish groups got together to create some type of mechanism. And Birnbaum, who's a British immigrant who had done work with Holocaust refugees in the past, says, we don't need a conference, we need a struggle. And he is really tuned in to, this might be the thing that it takes an immigrant to see. He's tuned in to the youth culture, the youth political culture in the US, and is realizing that that is where the energy is, and that if you actually want to create a movement, you go to the young people. And so that's what he does. And on May Day of 1964, they organize 1,000 people, and they get them out. This is within 1 week they get this rally planned, and they're out marching. It's a silent demonstration in front of the Soviet UN mission in New York. And Glenn Richter afterwards says, that was the last time that we made the mistake of being silent. We never had another silent demonstration. So this movement is, each group in the movement will see its part and will celebrate its part. The students will tell you, this was a student movement of the 1960s. Yes, but it was not only that. If you look at Seattle, look at Cleveland, you think about who's getting involved. It's not just baby boomers. It's also the so-called silent generation. They were not silent. It's members of World War II veterans were engaged in this. And then the baby boomers had kids, it was Generation X. So this was a movement that really was intergenerational. The student wing of it, the youth wing of it, and all that energy, student struggle is huge. And Jacob Birnbaum and Glenn Richter are the engines that are driving this early on, and they do a lot. And you'll see, if you look at the book, the ritual protest, they basically create a lot of the movement culture that then spreads throughout elsewhere.
I'm cheating. There's one person who's been patiently waiting. So go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so first, just to repeat, the Australian movement. And this, I focused on the States, and there's little things that touch on different aspects. I touch a bit on on activism in Australia here, and the role that Izzy Liebler played in the movement, and a particular episode around the Olympics. And before the U.S. boycotted the Olympics, activists saw this is a great moment to raise awareness. This is really far away. If you want to protest the Soviets, you have to wait until the Soviets come to you. So when they're sending cultural delegations and the like. But this is a moment when all eyes are going to be focused on the Olympic Games in Moscow, and it's a moment to organize. So Izzy Liebler was involved in the Australian Olympic Commission, And he was jetting from Australia to Soviet Union to Israel, this like triangle back and forth, figuring out ways to use the Olympic Games as a moment for rallying for Soviet Jews. What happens then is with the U.S. boycott, and there was a Western boycott, some countries still participated, all those plans really fell apart. Yeah, for 1980, right. But there was obviously activism that goes back before that. I don't have information about intermarriage among the Soviet Jews. Again, this was really a book about Western activism. There are lots and lots and lots of good books about Soviet Jewry, Soviet Jewish culture, and the like, but this is not that one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
For those of you who are here for your first time or for your 15th or beyond that time, we're here at ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People. We're proud to be the only museum of its kind where you can learn about the living story of the Jewish people, our culture, who we are, what we've contributed to society. Thank you for being here. Please make sure to go ahead and learn more about the movement. You can go ahead and see the special exhibit with the Smuckler families, donated by them thanks to their activism in Philadelphia, which you heard about today. If you're online, you can also, or any of you here, you can also access many of our exhibits and resources, the audio guide online from the comfort of your home or your iPhone or what have you. There are many programs to be had, and go ahead and take advantage, purchase this book, and just thank you for really bringing what we care about here in terms of understanding American culture, the Jewish people, and peoplehood to all of us here today and online. Thanks
Thank
again.
you. Thank you.